Remember the Calgary Bronks or the Calgary Rangers? Well, you always know I have to ask that question in my Remember the Calgary series. Now we're based on my analytics, and I'm thinking for how far back am I going to talk about some more Calgary sports teams in the past. I think that answer is no, but this is episode 20 in my Remember the Calgary series where we're talking about the Calgary Rangers and Bronx, as we're going back to the 1930s again. As the last few episodes I've talked about some hockey teams from the past, and just like what I've encountered in the past, I will have a hard time finding some relics to share in the video and get any information, especially when it's not a major professional team, as we'll talk about. So this is episode number 20. If you talk, speaking of previous episodes and previous hockey teams, you can see the previous episode right here in episode 19, where I talked about the Mustangs and A-16 Curry Army, where I talked about Calgary sports teams that were around during the Second World War. But as we start continuing to get closer to the end of my Remember the Calgary series, I'm going to say this is the last team that we're going back 80, 85, 90 years ago when it comes to the Calgary Bronx and Calgary Rangers. Also, as amongst my research, apparently there was also a Calgary Maroons team as well. So before I get to my notes, what inspired me to do this Remember the Calgary series, where I look at Calgary sports teams from the past and the funk teams, is as a Calgary sports fan, where I mostly talk about the major Calgary teams right now with the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders. Well, it started off when I took in the Calgary Hitmen Corral series, where the Calgary Hitmen were rebranded as the Centennials, the Cowboys, and the Wranglers, and I've already talked about those teams in this series as well, as you can see in the playlist. However, there's a local clothing company called Sea of Dead Clothing, where they specialized in logos of the Calgary sports teams in the past, from the 1980s and 90s that I've already talked about in this series as well. Still have to talk about later in the series, as well as that Chris Wilson story showing his Calgary sports jersey collection and that CBC sports story. So I have all that in the description below on where it inspired me to do this Remember the Calgary series, as well as any notes and relics that I have used to come up with my material. So let's get on to talking about the Calgary Rangers and Bronx, as pull up my notes. So we'll start off with the Calgary Bronx, as according to Wikipedia, it says they were a senior ice hockey team from Calgary, obviously. They were organized in 1928 in the Southern Alberta Senior League. It moved to the Alberta Senior League in the merger of 1936. And then it mentions as well, as I was able to find one picture of the Calgary Bronx championship, I meant to say, as the Bronx won the Southern League title in 1929-30 season. That's the one that I found. Then it also has 1931-32. I did find a relic online where I had that team picture. However, there was hands on it for some reason, so I figured I'm not going to share that. As well as 1932-33. They won the Alberta title in 1931-32, but lost the Western Canada final. And interesting with the Calgary Bronx is that it will lead into another team that I already talked about in this series, is they merged with the Calgary Rangers, which is the team that I'm talking about next in 1938, to form the Calgary Stampeders hockey team. Yes, Calgary had a Stampeders hockey team. So if you go back to episode number 15 in my Remember the Calgary series, I talked about the Calgary Stampeders hockey team, and I think I did mention that they came from this team that we're talking about, which is what this episode is all about right now. And then we'll look at some other tabs as well, as I'll get a lot of my information from Wikipedia, and then there's the hockey database. However, I keep tripping on to these Ice Hockey Wiki fandom sites as well that seems to find more information and more relics as well, because on the Ice Hockey Wiki site, it mentions the same opening paragraph that was mentioned on the Wikipedia page, but it breaks down the record by record of each season a little better, and it looks like just some type on a TXT format. So in 1928-29 season, in 18 games, they were 9-7-2 with 9 wins, 7 losses, and 2 ties for 20 points. They finished first, but they lost in the final. Then 1929-30, where they first won the championship in 16 games, they were 9-6-1. They were first in the division. And it says they won the final, but they lost in the provincial semifinal, so there must be another league they played in. And then in 1930-31 season, in 16 games, they were 6-7-3, 15 points. They mentioned they lost the semifinal. Then in 1931-32, they had a really great season, as in 20 games, they were 17-2-1, 35 points. It mentions that they were first, they won the final, and they lost in the West final. Then in 1932-33, in 16 games, they were still pretty good. 11-4-1, 13 points, they were first. And they mentioned won the final, lost in the provincial final. Then 1933-34, they slipped a little as they were, in 16 games, they were 5-10-1 for 11 points. They were third and did not qualify for the playoffs. This is the only time that the Calgary Rangers did not, or this is the Calgary Bronx, I should say, first, when they were in the Southern Alberta Senior Hockey League, that they missed the playoffs. Then 1934-35, in 18 games, they were 9-6-3 for 21 points. Finished second, but lost in the semifinal. Then the last season that they were in the, what was called the Southern Alberta Senior Hockey League, 1935-36, in 22 games, they were 9-2-1 for 19 points. They were second and then lost in the final. And then the last 2 seasons of existence, they moved into what was now the Alberta Senior Hockey League, so the league must have gotten bigger and acquired more teams. In 26 games, they played a longer season. In 1936-37, they were 15-10-1 for 31 points. Finished second, and they lost in the semifinal. And then the last season of existence, they really had a rough season in 26 games. They were 4-22 for 8 points. They were 6th in the league and did not make the playoffs. So that's what I mentioned for the Calgary Bronx. And it mentions there were 4 players that did play in the NHL. There was Fred Hergerts, Frank McCool, Sweeney Schreiner, and Eddie Wares. So those are the 4 players that played in the NHL that were on the Calgary Bronx team. So that's basically all I have for the Calgary Bronx. That logo I clipped for the thumbnail for this episode was the Bronx logo. So that's basically that first team, and I was able to find one team photo, which just kind of has that standard, silhouette style where you see all the pictures, so you'll see that at the end of the video. So now let's talk about the Calgary Rangers. We have our own Rangers to cheer for. Let's go Rangers. In 1920, the Rangers were an independent senior hockey team from 1926 to 1927. They were organized in 1 of 2 teams plus the Calgary Bronx, the team that I just talked about, in the Southern Alberta Senior League from 1933 to 1934. The 2 teams were part of the amalgamation of the Southern League in 1936 with the Edmonton League to form the Alberta League, so there was a couple leagues that formed together. The Rangers won the Alberta Senior title in 1937-38, but lost in the Western Canada quarterfinal. So I think that was that tournament they won the league. It's kind of similar to like what the Western Hockey League right now. And then it mentions here as well is that Calgary cannot support 2 senior teams at a time, so the 2 teams merged to be the Calgary Stampeders, which, once again, if you go back to season episode 15 to look at that team as well. And then there was a junior team. The Rangers had a junior team for 1 season from 1935-36. They won the City Junior League and the Provincial Junior title, but lost in the Western quarterfinal. So let's just look at the senior Alberta Hockey League record as well. So they were an independent team from 1926 to 27. So now when they were in the Southern Alberta Senior Hockey League for 1933-34, in 16 games, they were 10-5-1 for 21 points. They were first, but they lost to the final. Actually, they lost to I believe it was the Bronx. And then in 18 games, they were 4-12-2 for 10 points. They were fourth and were in the playoffs. Then the last season, they were in the Southern Alberta Senior Hockey League. They were 35-36, so they broke it up twice. In 22 games, they were 8-11-3 for 19 points. Third, and they were lost in the semifinal. And then 36-37 in 25 games, they were 16-17-2 for 34 points first, and they were lost in the semifinal. Then 37-38, the last season before they amalgamated with the Bronx and become the Calgary Stampeders. In 26 games, they were 19-4-3 for 41 points. They were first, and I mentioned they won the final. So, and then it doesn't mention anything about where any of the players from the Rangers then that ultimately played in the NHL, the National Hockey League. But good thing I did put off making this episode because eventually tripped on that there was a Calgary Maroons team. So when I mapped out all my episodes in the Remember the Calgary series, and when I was talking about hockey teams, I went to the hockey database site, and I just figured I would just cover all the teams, but the Calgary Maroons was not listed. So let's briefly talk about the Calgary Maroons. Is that they were also a senior team in Calgary. They also played in the Southern Alberta Senior Hockey League for 5 seasons. The Maroons won the Alberta Senior Hockey League title in 1920-29, but they could not advance. The league had withdrawn from the provincial playoffs, so that's very interesting back then. So now, when it comes to Alberta Senior Hockey League in 1928-29, in 18 games, they were 8-10 for 16 points. 4th in the standing, but they won the league final, as I mentioned. And then 1929-30, in 16 games, they were 5-9-2 for 12 points. They were 4th in the league, but they did not make the playoffs that year. And then 1930-31, in 16 games, they were 6-7-3 for 15 points, tied for 4th, but they lost in the quarterfinals, at least got into the playoffs. Then 1931-32, in 15 games, they were 5-10 for 10 points. Put in 3rd in the standings, but they did not make the playoffs. Then the last season, 1932-33, is definitely a season to forget, because in 16 games, they were 0-15-1 for 1 single point with a tie. 3rd and did not make the playoffs, so that's all I have for the Calgary Maroons, just on the outskirts of the teams as well. So when it comes to the Calgary Rangers, going back to the hockey database site for the 1933-36 when they were in the Alberta Senior Hockey League, there was a Sam Timmins that coached the team that mentions in 1933-34, and then when they moved to the Senior Hockey League as well, it doesn't mention who coached, but can't really say who led the team in scoring because you don't have any stats to talk about. So then when it comes to the Calgary Bronx, on the hockey database, there was an Archie McTeer that coached the team that mentions in 1935-36 with the same records. And then when they were in the Senior Hockey League, when it got rebranded, doesn't even mention who coached, but that's all I have. But I have all the links in the description below. So I'm just going to say, what do you know about the Calgary Rangers, Bronx, and Maroons? The Maroons is what I was able to find when I almost was thinking about making the episode, but then things came up and I was a little tired, so I put it off. And then when I did some more research, I tripped on the Maroons. So I'd say in that respect, it was a good thing that I put it off, because that team would have not been captured in my Remember the Calgary series for this episode. And I was also going to say, this is the last of the teams where I'm going way, way back, as when it comes to finding teams, information on teams and any relics from over 80, 90, 100 years ago in some cases. It's really hit or miss, especially not talking about a major league, because I know when the National Hockey League did their centennial celebration a few years ago, they did some more thorough research to make sure that they've dug up everything and got documentation on every game as well. And if you look on the Wikipedia, the Wega fan sites, it digs down deeper in the seasons by season on what the standings were and how the playoffs went as well. But I figured since I don't have as much information, you can look through that as well. I wasn't going to go over that in depth in this video as well. But I'm just going to say, do you remember? I mean, we're talking about your great-grandparents when they were children, or your grandparents were adults. But I would also just throw in that all these teams did also play in the Victoria Arena as well, which was pretty much the first major arena that Calgary's had before the Stampede Corral. And then, as of this recording, also the other reason why the Calgary men did their Corral series was because the Stampede Corral was slated for demolition and is being demolished as of this recording for the expansion of the BMO Centre. And then obviously the Stampede Corral was the major arena in Calgary before the now Scotiabank Saddledome, where originally it was called the Olympic Saddledome. And now in the next couple of years, we're going to get a new arena for the Calgary Flames as well as other teams. So I guess now eventually down the road, if I'm still doing this, I'll be talking about Remember the Saddledome, which not ready for that just yet, but we know that is coming. So in the next episode that I'll talk about for episode 21, in my Remember the Calgary series, we're still going to stay on the rink and talk about a team that still exists right now, but it's changed hands a few times. I'm going to call this one the Chinooks to Mustangs, as this team has been existed for over 50 years, but it came in Calgary first as the Chinooks when it moved from Pincher Creek, then eventually got rebranded as the Calgary Spurs, and then that team ceased operations, but a new businessman bought the team and revived it, and it became the Calgary Royals. So you might know what team I'll talk about in the Alberta Senior Hockey League. Then it got rebranded as the Calgary Mustangs, and now this team is slated to move to Blackfalds, Alberta, just north of Red Deer for the 2021-22 season. It'll be the Blackfalds Bulldogs. So that will be the team that I'll talk about in the next episode. And that team started in the 1970s up till now. It was a lot easier to find relics and information on that team, so that will be the next episode that I'll talk about in my Remember the Calgary series. So that's all I have for these 2-3 hockey teams when it comes to the Rangers, Bronks, and even the Maroons. The Maroons was something I found at the last second, as I mentioned. If I were to record this video when I originally planned to record it, the Maroons wouldn't have been talked about as well, and I would have to probably sneak it in somewhere. I know that if you go to my introduction video where I outline all the episodes that I plan to talk about, there will be a final recap episode as to give you a preview of what else that I still plan to talk about. Next episode I just talked about 21. Episode 22, there'll be Cougars and Trojans episode. Then episode 23, we'll go from the rink to the ball diamond and talk about the Calgary Vipers. Remember the Calgary Vipers? And then episode 24, I purposely put it towards the end of the series. I will finally talk about the Calgary Cannons. Remember the Calgary Cannons? I think that's going to be the team that I say most Calgary sports fans miss the most. And then episode 25 will be, I'll talk about Stampede Wrestling. And then I'll do a final recap and recap everything. I think what I plan to do for episode 26 for the final recap is at the beginning of every episode in this series, I always have to ask that question. So I think there might be a montage of me asking that question on all the teams that I've talked about. So that's all I have for this episode. So as I say, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, home of the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, and formerly home to the Rangers, Bronx, and Maroons, just make sure you hit like, subscribe. I also do personal vlogs, attempt to comedy, and I also do share my experiences I'm on the road at a sporting event. So if that all sounds like it'd be interesting to watch, to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, you know what you do, just say hit like, subscribe, and I also have my other social links down in the description below. Of course, when you subscribe, you'll know when this Calgary sports fan not only uploads new content, but as well as when he is going to upload the next episode in my Remember the Calgary series. And before I close out and to show you all those relics, there are a few that I have found, where I found a couple team pictures and then a couple advertisements for promoting the game, and or schedule, I should say, showing the schedule that these teams did exist. But I know that there's a subscription service that you can go on newspapers.com that was brought to my attention from a previous video that I did. I think it's Val Venture, if I said it right, who also specializes in Calgary stuff. I just say at that stage, I'm not willing to pay for a subscription right now. I know newspapers.com that you can find newspapers, but I still think it might be a little hard to find relics on these teams we're talking about as well, because it's been tough to find it online, but we're going back, 80, 90, 100 years in some cases, and it's not a major team. So I just want to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video or next episode, depending on what you like to watch on my YouTube channel. So thank you.